1945. Victory in Europe. Victory over Japan. Britain on the winning side. The British Empire stood at its greatest territorial extent. 500 million subjects, a quarter of the planet's land surface. Maps showed the empire larger than ever, red covering Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, the Pacific. 20 years later, 1965, almost all of it was gone. India, independent, 1947. Burma, independent, 1948. Ceylon, independent, 1948. Malaya, independent, 1957. Ghana, independent, 1957. Nigeria, independent, 1960. Kenya, independent, 1963. Zambia, independent, 1964. Dozens more, year after year, colony after colony, gone. The sudden demise of arguably the world's greatest empire in the years following the Second World War was a momentous event in global history. After nearly 4 centuries of colonial activity, the British relinquished their empire in a little more than 20 years. 20 years. That's faster than it took to build most colonies. It took Britain 150 years to fully conquer India. It took 16 months to leave. Open loop. Here's the question that haunts historians. Why so fast? Empires don't normally collapse this rapidly. Rome took centuries. The Ottoman Empire declined over 200 years. The Spanish Empire fragmented gradually across generations. But Britain? From global hegemon to mid-sized European power in 1 generation? Someone born in 1945 watched the empire at its peak. By the time they turned 20 in 1965, it was essentially gone. Pause. The conventional answers. World War II exhausted Britain. Nationalist movements demanded independence. The empire became too expensive. America and the Soviet Union replaced Britain as superpowers. All true, but incomplete. Because those factors don't explain the speed. Why didn't Britain fight harder? Why didn't decolonization take 50 years instead of 20? Why did policymakers seem overtaken by events? Challenge setup. This isn't just a story about why the empire ended.
Part A. September 1939. A war Britain couldn't afford. When Germany invaded Poland, Britain declared war. It was the right choice morally. Strategically and economically, it was catastrophic. Britain was already weakened from World War I, still hadn't fully recovered, still carrying massive debt. And now, total war against the most powerful military machine in Europe. The financial time bomb. Britain's national debt in 1939, £7.1 billion, already high from World War I. By 1945, £21 billion, an increase of nearly 200% in 6 years. As a percentage of GDP, over 250%. To put that in perspective, Britain's entire economic output for 2.5 years wouldn't be enough to pay the debt. Where did the money go? Total war is expensive, catastrophically expensive. Military spending consumed 55% of GDP in 1944. Think about that. More than half of everything Britain produced went to the war effort. Munitions factories running 24/7, naval construction and maintenance, Air Force expansion from 1,000 planes in 1939 to 9,000 plus by 1945, Army equipment for millions of soldiers, Lend-Lease repayments to America, food imports, Britain couldn't feed itself, raw materials for industry. Every day, millions of pounds burned. Every week, the debt grew. The asset liquidation. But debt was only part of the catastrophe. To pay for the war, Britain sold its global wealth. For centuries, Britain had invested overseas, owned railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in Malaya, infrastructure across the empire, American securities and bonds. The Americans insisted that the British sell their overseas assets before receiving Lend-Lease aid.
So Britain sold everything. Centuries of accumulated wealth liquidated to buy American weapons. By 1945, Britain's overseas investments had shrunk by approximately £1 billion, sold at fire sale prices to finance the war. Part B. The Merchant Fleet Catastrophe.
Act 2. The Financial Trap Springs, 1945 to 1947. 2,800 words. Approximately 14 minutes. Part A. August 21, 1945. The day aid stopped. 2 weeks after Japan surrendered, President Truman made a decision that sealed the empire's fate. He canceled Lend-Lease immediately. Large quantities of goods were in Britain or in transit when the Lend-Lease Act was terminated on August 21, 1945. Britain had been counting on continued aid for reconstruction, food shipments, raw materials, industrial equipment. Suddenly, nothing. The shock. The U.S. decision to cut off wartime Lend-Lease arrangements abruptly after VJ Day was a shock to Britain's newly elected Labour government. Think about what this meant. Britain couldn't feed its population without imports, couldn't rebuild without raw materials, couldn't export without industrial inputs, all of which required foreign exchange Britain didn't have. Truman later admitted the program should have continued longer, but the damage was done. Part B. Keynes goes to Washington, December 1945. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's greatest economist, traveled to Washington to negotiate emergency financing. He hoped for $6 billion as a grant or interest-free loan. He emphasized Britain's wartime sacrifice, standing alone 1940-1941, the devastation endured, the common cause against fascism. Surely America owed Britain something? The American response. American negotiators were unmoved. Congress and the American public, quote, have never accepted any literal principle of equal sacrifice between Allied participants. Translation: we don't owe you anything. The offer. America offered $3.75 billion at 2% interest. Terms. 1. 50-year repayment. Britain made the final payment December 29, 2006. 2. Sterling convertibility within 1 year. 3. Abolish imperial trade preferences. Open empire to American corporations. India was the empire's crown jewel. The numbers? 400 million people, 60% of the empire's population. The Indian Army? 2.5 million during World War II. Strategic location? Economic resources. Losing India meant losing the empire. Everyone understood this. So why did Britain leave so fast? February 20th, 1947. The announcement. Prime Minister Clement Attlee stood in Parliament. Britain would transfer power to Indian hands by June 1948. 16 months. That's all. For a colony ruled for 200 years, 16 months seemed impossibly fast. But then it got faster. Mountbatten accelerates, March to August 1947. Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived as the last viceroy in March 1947. His assessment? Hindu-Muslim tensions escalating daily, communal violence spreading, Indian Army's loyalty uncertain, British administrative control collapsing. Delay equals disaster. So he made a shocking decision. Move independence forward, not to June 1948, but to August 15, 1947. 10 months early. Mountbatten sought to anticipate the Attlee date and complete the process of handing over to Dominion governments by August or September of this year. Why the rush? The real reason? Britain was escaping. Britain wasn't being forced out by nationalism alone. Britain was escaping before the situation became Britain's financial disaster. The cost calculation? Maintaining order in India required 70,000 British troops permanently stationed,
massive administrative apparatus, infrastructure investment, suppressing growing nationalist resistance. Annual cost? Hundreds of millions of pounds. Britain didn't have. If Britain delayed and India descended into civil war, Britain would be blamed. Britain would be expected to restore order. Britain would be forced to deploy.
The triage strategy. Between 1948 and 1965, Britain made rapid decisions about every colony. Not based on morality or promises, based on cost-benefit analysis. The three categories. Category 1. Abandon immediately. Cost far exceeds value. High administrative costs, low economic return, rising nationalism. Solution? Grant independence fast. Examples: Palestine 1948, Sudan 1956, most of Africa 1957-1964. Category 2. Fight to control. High strategic or economic value. Profitable resources like rubber, tin, oil, strategic military bases, white settler populations. Solution? Counterinsurgency warfare. Examples: Malaya 1948-1960, Kenya 1952-1960, Cyprus 1955-1959, Aden 1963-1967. Category 3. Negotiate transition. Some value, unsustainable to hold. Economic importance but nationalist pressure. Can't afford to fight, can't afford to leave abruptly. Solution? Negotiated independence with favorable terms. Examples: Nigeria, Ghana, East African territories. Palestine, the first abandonment. May 14, 1948, Britain withdrew from Palestine. Why so sudden? Palestine had become ungovernable. Jewish insurgency, Urgun and Lehi attacking British forces, Arab-Jewish violence, no solution acceptable to both sides. Maintaining order, 100,000 British troops, costing millions monthly. Britain referred the problem to the UN, then left. Let the UN deal with it. Let Jews and Arabs fight it out. Britain escaped responsibility and cost. Malaya, when Britain fought. June 1948, communist insurgency began in Malaya. Britain's response? 12 years of brutal counterinsurgency warfare. Why fight so hard here when abandoning Palestine and India? Because Malaya was profitable. Rubber, critical commodity, high demand, especially during Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Tin, valuable export. Strategic location, controlling Straits of Malacca. Britain deployed hundreds of thousands of troops. The French comparison. France also had an empire, also fought in WWII, also weakened. But French decolonization took much longer and was far more violent. Algeria. France fought from 1954 to 1962, 8 years of brutal war, 500,000 dead. Indochina, Vietnam. France fought from 1946 to 1954, defeated at Dien Bien Phu. Why did France fight longer than Britain? 3 key differences. First, different economic situations. France emerged from WWII devastated, occupied 1940 to 1944, but received massive Marshall Plan aid, $2.3 billion. Currency not a global reserve, less pressure, could borrow more freely. Britain emerged from WWII financially exhausted, but not occupied. Limited Marshall aid, much went to repaying American loans. Pound sterling still reserve currency, vulnerable to speculation, already massively indebted. France could afford longer colonial wars. Britain couldn't. Second, different political cultures. France, colonial empire integral to French identity. Algérie française, Algeria considered part of France. Large settler populations, 1 million in Algeria. Political consensus supporting empire. Britain, empire increasingly seen as burden. Labour government 1945 to 1951, ideologically anti-imperial. Public demanding domestic priorities. Less political consensus. Third, different American pressure. On France, America anti-colonial but focused on containing communism. Some support for French Indochina War as anti-communist.
less financial leverage over France. On Britain, America actively undermining British Empire, financial leverage through loans, diplomatic pressure through UN. Lend-Lease created dependency. France could fight longer, Britain couldn't. The Portuguese comparison. Portugal held its African colonies until 1975. Angola, Mozambique, Portugal fought for 13 years, 1961 to 1974. Why did Portugal's empire last longer? Because Portugal was poor and dictatorial. Salazar's dictatorship, no democratic accountability, no domestic pressure for decolonization, colonial wars hidden from public.
The bureaucratic machinery of rapid decolonization. How did Britain actually execute such rapid withdrawal? The constitutional template. Britain had developed dominion status, self-governing but within Commonwealth. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, all peaceful transitions. Britain applied this template everywhere. First, negotiations with local leaders. Second, constitutional conferences in London. Third, transfer power to elected government. Fourth, maintain Commonwealth membership. Fifth, British troops withdraw. Repeat 40+ times in 20 years. The governor system. Every colony had a British governor. In the 1940s to 1960s, their job changed from governing to managing withdrawal. Instructions from London: negotiate with nationalists, prepare constitutional frameworks, arrange elections, transfer power, get out. Governors who resisted were replaced. The violence Britain accepted. Speed required accepting violence Britain would have previously prevented. India and Pakistan partition, 200,000 to 2 million dead. Britain published borders after independence. Palestine, Jewish-Arab civil war. Britain referred to UN and left. Cyprus, Greek-Turkish violence. Britain negotiated independence despite ongoing conflict. Nigeria, Biafran War, 1967 to 1970, killed 1 to 3 million. Britain had left in 1960. In previous eras, Britain would have stayed to maintain order. In 1945 to 1965, Britain accepted chaos as the price of rapid withdrawal. Morally questionable, financially necessary. The informal empire strategy. Britain didn't just abandon colonies. Britain restructured imperial control. From direct political rule, British governors and administrators, military occupation, formal empire, to economic influence, Commonwealth membership, sterling area currency ties, military agreements, cultural and institutional ties, neo-colonialism. Britain gave away what was expensive, political control, while keeping what was profitable, economic access. This made rapid decolonization strategically acceptable.
East of Suez, 1968. January 16, 1968. Harold Wilson's government announced British armed forces will withdraw from major military bases east of Suez. Over 50,000 military personnel withdrawn from Far East by 1971. Bases in Singapore, Malaysia, Persian Gulf, Aden, Hong Kong reduced. All abandoned or reduced. Why? Britain couldn't afford them anymore. The 1967 pound devaluation, 30% drop, made maintaining overseas bases financially impossible. Simple as that. The scattered remnants. By 1970, Britain retained only 14 overseas territories, mostly tiny islands. Gibraltar, strategic. Falklands, symbolic. Hong Kong, lease until 1997. Caribbean islands, Atlantic islands. Not an empire. Remnants. Hong Kong, the last. July 1st, 1997. Hong Kong returned to China, the last major British territory. Why did Britain keep Hong Kong until 1997? Because the lease didn't expire until then. 99-year lease from 1898. When it expired, Britain had no choice.
China could have taken Hong Kong by force any time after 1949. Britain couldn't defend it. The handover was negotiated because China allowed it, not because Britain had power.
Why did the British Empire collapse so fast after World War II? The answer? 5 converging factors that created unstoppable momentum. Factor 1. Total financial exhaustion. £21 billion debt, currency crisis, asset liquidation, American loan dependency. Britain was bankrupt. Maintaining empire was impossible. Speed was financially forced. Factor 2. American anti-imperialist pressure. America actively dismantled British Empire through loan conditions, diplomatic pressure, UN support for decolonization, financial leverage. Britain's closest ally was its empire's greatest enemy. Factor 3. Nationalist movements synchronized. Post-1945 saw simultaneous uprisings. India, Quit India movement. Burma, Independence Army. Malaya, communist insurgency. Kenya, Mau Mau. Cyprus, Ioka. Aden, NLF. Britain couldn't fight everywhere at once. Triage was necessary. Factor 4. Democratic accountability. British voters demanded food, still rationed until 1954. Housing, massive shortage. Healthcare, NHS founded in 1948. Jobs for returning soldiers, not colonial wars. Democracy accelerated withdrawal. Factor 5. Strategic pivot to America. Britain chose American alliance over empire. Special relationship required supporting American Cold War strategy, accepting American economic leadership, dismantling imperial preferences. Britain traded empire for American protection. Could it have been slower? No. Some historians suggest Britain could have held colonies longer, but the financial mathematics were inexorable. Cost of empire exceeds revenue plus borrowing capacity. Once that equation became permanent, rapid collapse was inevitable. Fighting would have